Long, long ago, Art, son of Con, who had won 100 battles, fell madly in love with the beautiful maiden, surely the most beautiful woman he had ever clapped his eyes upon, Echter. Now it is said in some accounts that Echter was the daughter of a blacksmith, and in others that she was the daughter of a druid. But of course there is no reason why both those statements cannot be true at one and the same time. But however her lineage may be, there came the day early on in her marriage to Art that, having gone to bed and done what young married couples are wont to do, they fell deeply asleep. And during the night, Echter had such a dream. She dreamt that she was standing on the edge of a wood, looking out across the lands of Ireland. And then suddenly from somewhere a sword came whistling past, and she did not see who wielded it, but her head was taken off and rolled into the grass and sat there, if a head can be said to sit, looking up at the rest of her body, which was stood stock still. And instead of blood gouting out everywhere as what happened in real life, in the dream green shoots began to sprout out from her neck, instead of spouts and spurts of blood. And these shoots, at the kind of speed that only takes place in dreams, formed into great branches until her body had become like an oak tree. And she watched this, her severed head looking up at her once human body, now tree body, with wonderment. And it seemed to her in the dream that a great age passed, many years passed, before there came an enormous wave crashing over from the coast and smashing down into the forest, toppling that ancient tree until it fell, its roots uprooted, its branches shattered, its leaves and its acorns hither and yon. And then the waters receded, and the head, which had somehow survived this great deluge of water, sat there looking sadly at the broken tree body. But even as the tree looked, as she looked at the tree, shoots began to emerge from the shattered body of the tree. From the broken trunk and the broken branches, new life came out, and another tree grew from where the oak tree had fallen, as will sometimes happen with willow trees, but rarely, if ever, with oak trees. But oak it was, and the new oak grew from the fallen body of the old oak, not as big, nor as grand, nor as impressive as the previous oak, but none the less a sizable oak with a great sheltering canopy, and badgers and boars and bears and wolves and deer and all manner of creatures came to gather under the canopy of that not quite so mighty oak. And so again it seemed to the head looking up that a great passage of years went past, when the wind began to whip up and whirl and howl, until that terrible cold freezing western wind tore down the tree, and it fell shattered to earth. And then she awoke with a start, sweating and shaking and shivering, nudging her husband awake, who bleary-eyed said, what is it, love, what is it? And she told to him the dream she had had. And it was the way of people in that time in Ireland, and still many parts of Ireland, I'm sure, to this very day, that people took their dreams quite seriously. And so Art, far from rolling over and going back to sleep, listened and thought. And he said, "My love, I think this is the way of it. I am no druid, but I think this is the way of your dream. When your head was chopped off, I am like to your head." And it may be that he meant he was the head of the household, or it may be that, as St. Bridget was to say a couple of centuries later, that a person without an anam cara, a friend of their soul, is like a body without a head, and so perhaps Art was as much her soul friend as husband and king. But whatever the way of that is meant, he said, "I am like to the head, and when you dreamt that I would be chopped off and I would roll upon the floor, or at least your head would roll upon the floor, I think you have had a prophecy that I am to fall by violence, I am to fall at the sword. And that you dreamt it at all, I think, means that this will happen sooner rather than later. And her heart raced for fear that her husband would be taken from her so early in their marriage. And then that great tree that grew out of your body with vast branches overshadowing the whole of the forest, that, I think, means that you are to have a child, my child, and that he will grow to be like a mighty oak, a great king who will be far greater than I ever could be, and cast his shadow long over Ireland. And this she felt better about. But what of the wave, she said, what of the wave? Well, it seems to me that perhaps that too is symbolic of how he will fall, for all men must one day come to the end of their lives, and that whatever it is that will bring him down towards the end of his life, and you did say it would be over many, many years that your head set in the grass watching this. It was not a short reign, but a long reign. But whatever it is that polishes him off will be something that comes from the ocean, that comes from the seas. And they wondered what that could be. Could it be one of the terrible Vamori, the great sea beasts of whom ancient myth spoke, who had not been seen in the land of Ireland for many, many, many a long year? In fact, even the elderly could not remember the last time one of the Vamori had been seen to come on land, but you never know. They may come again. Could it be pirates? Could it be brigands? Could it be some army from over the waves coming in? Well, they weren't sure, but they thought on it. And then, said Art, taking a swig of mead from the horn he kept always ready by the bed in case he should wake up dry in the night, then I think that another tree that grew from the shattered remains of that first tree means that our son will have in his turn a son, our grandson, and he will grow to be great and will be a shelter to many. But you said the second tree was not as big as the first tree, so perhaps his fame will not be quite as far-reaching as the fame of his father, but a good tree, a strong tree nonetheless, a long-lasting tree. And as to the great wind that whipped in from the west and broke that second tree, shattered it, and led you to awake, well, it may be some enemy from a western land, except of course west of Ireland there is nothing but ocean upon ocean upon ocean. But I think to myself that perhaps the west wind here is a symbol of the Fina, the warrior bands of Ireland, for they move swifter than the wind, and whilst we have always sought their friendship, perhaps in some future year, in the lifetime of our grandson, when he one day is king, something will happen and he will fall at their hand, rather than at the hand of some far distant enemy. And thinking on this, they discussed it for some days to come, and returned to it, and they consulted the Druids, and the Druids agreed that Art's interpretation had been a very wise one, a very likely one, as to what this dream prophesied. And Art made preparation. He spoke to his wife about what they should do if this prophecy of the falling head should come about sooner rather than later. And it was not but a few months after this event that Echta began to grow heavy with child. And she was rejoicing and happy in this, but also at the same time a recollection of that dream and the fear that first the head fell, then the tree grew. And if this infant in her womb was the tree, that great and mighty oak tree, surely the head would fall first. And as much as she was happy to be with child, she also feared that her husband's days were numbered, and she was right to fear that. For even as she reached the end of her pregnancy, as the 9 months were almost at an end, a war came to Ireland, a war led by a very nephew of King Art himself, a lad called Macon, I say a lad, a young man by then, who had previously been banished, been exiled from Ireland itself for raising an army against the High King for mere treason. He had returned with an army of mercenaries whipped up from amongst the tribes of the Britons and the tribes of the Picts. Warriors who had no care or concern for the politics of Ireland and the intertribal relationships, people who fought simply for money, and no greater reason than that. But men who fight for money are as dangerous as men who fight for ideals. And so Macon returned to Ireland with his newfound army of people from over the waters, determined to overthrow the High King and claim the land for himself. And they met Art, the king, and Macon, the treacherous nephew, and their respective armies. They met upon the field of battle. They fought and they fought. Blades flashed, arrows flew, spears were hurled, shield clashed against shield, blood gouted into Ireland soil. Pictish blood and British blood and Irish blood fed the land, until at length Art himself fell to a sword blow and his head rolled across the field of battle. And up upon the hill yonder, there were the druids, the wives, the children, the aged relatives of the warriors down below, or the Irish warriors, not the Pictish or the British warriors who were over in their own homeland, but the Irish warriors, the men and warrior women who fought in the armies of Art were up on the hill watching, and when they saw the king fall, word was sent racing to the court to notify not only the queen herself but the courtiers that the throne was now vacated and they must prepare themselves for what was to come next. And it had been that in those long conversations between husband and wife in the aftermath of the dream, that Art had suggested to his wife, should he die by sword, by weapon, by warfare, unexpectedly and suddenly, as the dream seemed to indicate, that she should seek protection and solace from one of his dearest friends over in the tribe of the Connachta, over to the western part of Ireland, under the protection of Lunna, the great warrior. This had been arranged with him. He knew to expect, should such an event happen, to expect Ector to come to him, and that he would, as per agreement, give her shelter and protection for as many years as she should need it. And so, knowing that these armies of Macon, the Picts and the Britons, having killed the king, would very soon vanquish the other warriors and turn their greedy eyes upon the palace of Tara itself, the hill of Tara, and the conquest of the thrones of the high kings. Well, she wasted no time. She threw a few things into a sack, into a bag, summoned a handmaiden, and leapt the pair of them into the back of a chariot, and off they rode as fast as they could towards the lands of the Connachta tribe and the protection of Lunna. Hour after hour after hour after hour they rode, and hard going it was, for whilst both women were used to horses, they were more used to gently trotting around as high-born aristocratic ladies do. They were not used to storming across the land in a chariot, the wind whipping their hair, grief rending their hearts, not knowing what awaited them, not knowing what they were pursued by. This was not the lifestyle of the high-born ladies, but they did their best. And there came the time when the evening was growing heavy and it was growing darker, and the horse pulling the chariot was sweating and sweating, and clearly they needed to stop for the sake of the horses, because of the risks of riding in darkness, because they were tired and they were cold and they were hungry and they were grieving. And so they did indeed stop the chariot, and they took the harnesses off the horse, so that the poor beast might go to a river and drink and chew the cud and have something to eat. And they found a small bothy in the woods. They made themselves a shelter of ferns and covered it with branches, a place they could sleep and they could rest. and they lay themselves down, the two women, whilst the horse was off yonder, drinking from a river, and they fell into a deep, deep sleep. And it may be that that sleep was aided and assisted by a little magic, for it was an unusually deep sleep. So deep, in fact, that neither of them noticed when the horse wandered off on its own, losing itself in the far distant hills. Nor did they notice when a she-wolf padded silently through the woods, not cracking a twig, not rustling a leaf, but moving like a sleek, grey, yellow-eyed ghost through the woods, following the scents and picking up the aroma of these women, of their sweat, of their fear, of their exotic perfumes that ladies of high-born status wore, and came to their bothy and sat watching them through its glinting, mirrored yellow eyes. And as the wolf watched, Echta gave birth. She awoke long enough from her deep and magical dream sleep to give birth, but she gave birth and she cradled the child in her arms before this magical dream sleep, this almost coma that she fell into reasserted itself, and she fell back into unconsciousness. The babe cradled in her arms. And the wolf watched, and it watched, and it watched. And then the wolf padded closer and closer and closer, and she leaned in, her muzzle approaching the mother and babe, and snapped and bit the umbilical cord in two. And then, gentle as gentle can be, she picked up that newborn baby in her teeth. Not to eat it or to rip it apart, but to carry it. To carry that baby back to her cave, to her wolf cave. And she was gone. And come the dawn light, the golden rays spreading through the green branches of the forest, light fell upon the faces of both queen and handmaiden, and they awoke. And Echta had memories of a baby. Had I dreamt it, because there was no baby in her arms? And she said to her handmaiden, I had the strangest dream last night that I gave birth. And the handmaiden looked at her, and the great bump of her pregnancy was gone. And there was blood and amniotic fluids upon the twigs and branches and ferns that they had created for a bed. And there was the other half of the umbilical cord snapped in two. And the handmaiden said, that was no dream, my lady. You clearly must have given birth. This woods must be a magical place, a druid place, that I slept through it without hearing, and that you fell back deep asleep afterwards. But where is your baby? And they thought at first maybe it had crawled off, although, of course, the handmaiden, who had tended many a well-born lady and seen many a birth newborn babies do not go crawling. It takes a while for that to happen. But she tried to reassure her mistress that maybe it had crawled off, and they looked, but of the baby there was no sign. And of course the mother grew more and more fretful and worried and panicked, and all the while her handmaiden reassured her that had this child come to some harm, and barely had she finished saying it, then a great lupine howl echoed throughout the forest, and the two women clutched each other, realising, as if they didn't know in the first place, that Ireland is referred to, and continued to be referred to long into the day and age of Shakespeare, as the wolf country. And Echta said, has my child been eaten by a wolf? Could that be it? But her handmaiden said, if that was the case, there would be blood. Why just eat the baby? Why not eat the pair of us at the same time, if they were so minded? And she tried as much as she could to rationalise.
The baby must still be alive somewhere, and if this was a magical forest, maybe the she or some other spirit people has taken the baby and kept him. A few hours of searching, they came to the conclusion that there was nothing else they could do. And of course by that time they fully realised that their horse had gone off, leaving the chariot, which was precious little use without a horse to pull it. And they were still a good few miles from the tribe of the Connachta and the protection of Luna. And as they were tearing their hair out and wondering what on earth they could do, and looking at the chariot and thinking, could one of them sit in it and the other one pull it, would that work? They heard the thundering of hooves. And looking yonder to the west, they saw a small group of men riding towards them. And at first they were panicked, thinking that this was the men of Nachon come to slit their throats, although the men of Nachon should really have been riding from the other direction, not from the west. But it was only when they came close enough that the two women could see the colours they were flying, they breathed a sigh of relief, realising that these were the warriors of the Connachta and not the warriors of Nachon. And there was Lana himself, an old, familiar, friendly face, leading the platoon of men as they came forth. And he said, well, the word came to us on messenger that Art has fallen, and I knew to expect you, and when you didn't arrive I began to fret that maybe Art had beset you, or you'd had an accident, and I see your chariot is horseless. And the two women poured out their heart of everything that had befallen them. And Echta sobbed, and she sobbed for the death of her father, for the loss of her child, for her confusion, her fear, her bewilderment. And again the wolves in the wood howled, a great chorus of them, a song of wolves. And had Echta or Lana or the handmaiden or the warriors but been able to understand the tongue of the wolves, they would have known full well what had happened. For the wolves were singing of it, but none of them were so possessed, so gifted. And so they left behind the wood, which Lana told the two women was called the Wood of Creva, and off they rode on horseback, sitting behind the queen, behind Luna, and the handmaiden behind one of the warriors. They rode back to the lands of the Connachta and the great hall of Luna in his village, his settlement, and they were fed and they were watered and they were given clean clothes and bathed and tended to by physicians, for it was only a few hours since Echta had given birth. And Luna himself summoned his warriors, his aristocrat and peasant alike came to him, and he said, a child is now missing, a newborn infant. I want you to search far and to search wide, and to whichever one of you finds it, I will give you such reward as your heart desires. Which is perhaps a rather unwise thing to promise, but promised it he did. And for day upon day upon day, the men, whether the high-born or middle-born or low-born of the tribe, and indeed many of the women too, searched high and low. They looked in woods here and in bogs there and in stony land here and on the seashore there. They searched and they looked and they looked and they searched in the hopes of finding this infant. And it wasn't till nearly a full month had passed that a humble warrior of very low-born status by the name of Grech, even, by the name of Grech, found a cave deep in the Creva woods at the roots of a mountain. And he didn't even need to look in the cave, for as he was making his way through the woods, he peered between trees, hearing giggling, gurgling noises, wondering what on earth it could be, and very cautiously peering through the woods, he saw a pack of wolf cubs frolicking in the sun, playing with each other, and an infant playing with them.
crawling around on all fours, a very small infant, but nonetheless crawling around on all fours like a wolf cub. And in between giggling and gurgling, making little woofing and yipping noises like the wolf cubs. And there was the she-wolf, the mother of them all. And where the father was, well, probably out hunting or something. But Grech stood for a while, slack-jawed, bewildered at the sight of this. He had heard tell of such tales, it was not unknown, but had never really believed any of such tales to be true, that a wolf could take in a human infant and raise that child as her own. And for a full month this infant had fed and suckled upon the wolf teat, just as the cubs did. And indeed, even as Grech stood and watched, he saw the mother lay upon her side, and saw the cubs go up to suckle, and saw that human babe crawl along to join them and suckle at the wolf teat. And when they'd all finished, cub and child alike, the mother got up and off into the woods she went, perhaps hunting, perhaps getting a whiff of human upon the air and panicking, who can say, but off she went. And Grech, after some thought, marked one of the trees with his knife and wandered back the way he had came. And every now and then he stopped and he marked another tree with the same symbol from his knife and made his way back to the court of Lunna and said to Lunna, "You promised my heart's desire or the heart's desire of any person who found the infant. Well, I have found the infant, and if you give me my heart's desire, I will take you to it." Well, Ector was overjoyed, Lunna was overjoyed, and the handmaiden was overjoyed, and Lunna said to him, "Well, what is it you desired?" And Grech, having been a man of humble birth, didn't demand the earth as some more arrogant people might, but asked for a few small parcels of land to be made for him and his children and his grandchildren in perpetuity. And so the clan of Grech and his descendants were granted the land, and they live there still. And this promise having been fulfilled, Grech led mother and handmaiden and Lunna and a couple of warriors to accompany them back to the woods. And if at any point he became a little lost or disoriented in the woods, he would look around until he found a tree with his mark carved into the side of it to guide him through the woods until they came to the last tree, the one that was just this side of the glade where the wolf cave is. And there he shushed them all, and they peered through and they watched, and they saw a scene very like the one that Grech had first seen earlier that day. They saw cubs and infant crawling about on the floor. They saw the she-wolf lying on her side and allowing cubs and infant alike to suckle from her. And then one of them, it could have been the warrior, it could have been the handmaiden, it could have been any of them, trod upon a twig, and there was a loud crack. And the she-wolf, her head peering up, looked around, and scenting on the wind and panicking, she turned tail and fled into the forest, leaving her cubs and the infant boy behind her. And at this, Ector, filled with a mother's love, could wait no longer. She rushed into the glade and she picked up her newborn baby, month-old baby, and hugged him to her, tears flowing down her face. Her handmaiden rejoiced. Lunna breathed a great sigh of relief to know the line of his dearest friend, Art, was being continued, and that the baby was safe, and shook his head in wonder to see the miracle of the she-wolf having suckled the child for so long, and ordered that not only should the baby be brought home, but all of the cubs should be brought home with him. For it seemed to Lunna that they were the dearest friends with each other, cubs and this yet unnamed child were as dear could be. And so that is what happened. The baby was brought back, the cubs were brought back, they were fed and looked after and watered and played together for the remainder of their lives. As the wolves grew, obviously at a faster rate than the boy grew, they became his guardians, his protectors, his watchdogs, or watchwolves if you prefer. And it was said that even though he had spent just a month being suckled by a she-wolf, that for the remainder of his life, and he did become the great king that his mother's dream had prophesied, that for the remainder of his life he was as much wolf as man, in his movements, his gestures, his watching, his scenting of the air, his acute hearing. And those wolves remained loyal to him, a guardian pack around him. And when the time came those wolves were old enough to find mates of their own, they brought their mates to court. And when they had cubs of their own, their cubs stayed within court. And the wolves did not leave until Cormac mac Art, for such was the baby called, himself, many, many years later, and several generations of wolves later, only when the king himself died, like the great tree falling in the wave that his mother had predicted, only then did the wolves of Cormac mac Art return to the forests and the mountains and the hillsides, and did not come back to the court again.